thank you guys for sticking around. We're going to try to keep this moving because I know it's the end and there's a lot to absorb. I'm Charlie Warzel. I am a senior technology reporter for BuzzFeed News. Nowadays, that's basically the dystopia beat, as a bunch of us like to call it. And so this panel is titled "Clickbait: Algorithms, Radicalization, and the Fight for Our Attention." Tristan, who is just the expert on a lot of this stuff, was a great primer there. It's very broad, but what I'm basically thinking about this panel here is that what unites all of this is the notion that across the internet we're being pushed and pulled toward information and guided by all these seemingly unseen forces. And those that can manipulate those forces best have a lot of the power over all of the rhetoric. And so I wanted to introduce our experts, people who I just think are the people to hear from on this subject. We have Dr. Kate Starbird, who is an assistant professor of human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington. Dr. Guillaume Chaslot, the co-founder of algotransparency.org. Ms. Camille Francois, the research and analysis director at Graphika and also a Mozilla fellow, I believe. And Mr. Nigel Gwilliam, the consultant head of media and emerging tech, the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. So, what I really wanted to do right now is ask you guys what, as people who are paying attention to every development in all these different fields in the disinformation system, which is very complex, what are you seeing out there right now that's new, that's sort of keeping you up at night? I just want to go down the line.
I guess, so I'm not sure I can say what's new because our research works at a pace that's a little bit slower. We're still looking at we're still looking at data from 2017. And a couple of the things that are just become salient in the research that we've been doing that do keep me up at night. One of them is the way that a lot of the disinformation campaigns we're seeing actually target what would otherwise be organic political activism and kind of target that, whether it's Black Lives Matter or it's these pro-Palestinian groups that became supporters of Assad in Syria, that they target these groups, they kind of infiltrate them, and they begin to cultivate and shape these political groups towards different kinds of, towards their strategic goals. And I think the reason that keeps me up at night, I think it makes a really complex case for the platform designers of like, how do we, address this disinformation problem, and how do we, take out the inauthentic actors when the inauthentic actors are actually integrated into systems that have very authentic actors and look very similar. And for me, I guess the thing that keeps us up nights is we can spend hundreds of hours looking at one particular case and even one particular account and still can't quite say, with 100% with 100% certainty, that's an inauthentic actor. And so I think it makes both a complex technical problem, but it's also a complex socio-technical problem of how do they decide, if we're going to do something to limit some of these things, what are the criteria for deciding what an authentic versus an inauthentic actor are? And then just also how profoundly vulnerable we are in those spaces where we're exerting our political identity and we care about something and we're out there trying to make our voices heard, which we heard that's what the internet is for, and yet that's sometimes where we're the most vulnerable.
So for me, it's how people don't realize how important the influence of AI is in the spread of information. So people think AI is about solving a medicine problem or stuff like that, but no, AI is already controlling our information. The jobs that have been replaced by AI are journalists. A lot of journalists disappeared, and instead it's AI curating our information on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter. So what keeps me up at night is which decisions does this AI take? Does the AI really have your best interest in mind? And at the moment, the answer is clearly no.
I think what keeps me up at night is also what Kate mentioned, how difficult it's turning out to be to separate true grassroots organic behavior on social media from coordinated, fabricated, manipulated behavior. And I worry about that because I think as we over-focus on the coordinated, inauthentic one, we might also hurt movements that are true grassroots, spontaneous movements that we ought to protect. And a recent example of that that comes to mind was in Turkey. It was the first time where I was asked to analyze the social media movement, not to demonstrate that it was inorganic and coordinated, but to validate that it was actually true spontaneous grassroots. It was after President Erdogan said, if the country says enough, I will step down. There was a massive movement on social media around the hashtag Tamam. And of course, he immediately said, oh yeah, I saw the social media stuff. That's bots and trolls. And we kind of, we collectively headed there, and then we had to do an analysis saying, no, it's neither bots nor trolls, and it's not actually coordinated from abroad. This is the types of true grassroots activism that denounces corruption, promotes the truth, empowers civil society that we ought to care about and protect and be able to care for. And so what I think keeps me up at night is, how do we make sure that we keep the parts of the internet that we value and that we want to encourage as we sort of double down on the bots and the trolls and the manipulation?
I think kind of building on that in many respects, strangely it's actually probably human ingenuity that keeps me up late at night, and the kind of the dark side of human ingenuity and the ability to conceive of how to game systems, and that generating unforeseen consequences. So, which all sounds very theoretical, but just the idea of an authoritarian leader talking about, well, I saw all this, but that was just bots and trolls. That very kind of human reaction. I think just a couple of examples of that you could never foresee. I'm obviously from the UK. We've got an issue or two with Brexit at the moment. We've just appointed a food supplies minister because it's going so well. We actually might have food riots and starve to death. But the single largest political donation in the UK, it's a very different market to the US. It's by a guy called Aaron Banks, donated £8.4 million, about $10 million. And he was called before a select committee to discuss, what he'd done and how he'd done it. And that select committee of MPs, Ministers of Parliament, concluded in their report that he had failed to convince them that £8.4 million hadn't come from overseas, in other words, Russia. And he is still active now. He's actually right now running a political hip campaign on MPs that voted to remain but represent Leave constituencies. He's running a targeted Facebook campaign. So that's on one political extreme, unforeseen consequences. On the left, slightly more light-hearted, there's a guy called Jeremy Corbyn. He's the leader of the left-wing Labour Party. He's kind of like Bernie Sanders on steroids. And his opinions are very left, even for his party. So his own comms team ran a campaign where he and his clique were targeted, micro-targeted with a Facebook campaign, so it looked like his most extreme policies were being published to the general public, but they were just shown to him and his colleagues. So his own party micro-targeted him. So these are just things we couldn't foresee, and that does keep me awake at night.
I think the idea of unforeseen consequences is, it's something as a journalist that I think it's hard to put ourselves. We're always sort of reporting with hindsight being 20/20. I wanted to ask you, Guillaume, because you've rather famously worked with these technology companies, helping in this space to build some of the issues that we have here now. How do you feel, with a place like YouTube? How do you feel that the people who have built these systems, how are they grappling with that now? And what is sort of the mentality there? Because I think there is this large reckoning, but I think a lot of us on the outside don't know how people are thinking about it.
Yes, so from the inside, it was very interesting to see that we had just one goal. It was watch time, keeping people longer and longer. So you had OKRs, and you had to increase watch time by like 1%, 2%, 5% was fantastic if you could like increase watch time and YouTube by 5% in a few months. Then it was like billions of dollars, literally. So a small team could do that. So that was amazing, but we didn't focus on anything else. Anything else was a distraction. So for instance, we are talking about fact-checking tools that would help people find correct information and incorrect information. I proposed one of these tools in 2011. I won an innovation award about this tool, but then it was never pushed to production because my manager said it was not the focus. So by just focusing on watch time and then thinking whatever happens is the fault of the user, if they're looking at racist thing, it must be that user like racist things. What can I do? But actually, the things that you try to optimize will self-amplify.
Would a tool like that, the fact check tool, imposed in 2011 at a different time, for with the scale being somewhat less, would it have been easier than now?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like
Camille, you also have some experience in this world.
I left Google about 6 months ago to move into a startup. And I think, Guillaume, the work that you did and others like you, when I was there, really showed. And I think I was very lucky to work with teams who had different OKRs and who actually cared and wanted to tackle these problems. We led a series of pilot programs to see how we could show people other videos that would help de-radicalize them with, of course, their consent and transparency. So I'm sort of like happy to report that I think some of that message has been received by the industry, and I was encouraged by how many people there really had for their primary objective to fight against that problem. Now, with that being said, what does keep me up at night, though, is how do we go and prioritize? Because you still need an incredible amount of human time, strategic thinking to properly address these issues. Guillaume, as you noted, AI is absolutely not in a technical place where this can actually be the full solution. And therefore, what ends up being the prioritization process is whatever's going to hit the fucking New York Times tomorrow. Oh, I said I was not going to swear.
I endorse
Nick,
it
this
for
one's
whatever.
for you. So the prioritization process remains like, what's going to hit the New York Times tomorrow, right? We have people dedicated to making sure that bad things doesn't happen. Where are we going to focus their attention? And I think what that creates is sort of empathy voids, entire issues that are very complex, that are just not on the top of the agenda. It's not that people are not staffed in solving those problems. It's not that there are not teams and processes. It's just they fall so low on the agenda. And Kate, I think unfortunately, Syria sometimes, and you can talk about the work that you've done there, and groups like the group of the White Helmets who are sustaining enormous amounts of harassment campaigns. Well, it's not that it's not documented. It's not that people don't know about it. It's not that it's not, on people's OKR to deal with it. It's just so low on the agenda. And how do we prioritize fixing those harms in an environment in which it's happening globally and in which it's targeting, threatened voices in society? I think is a very complex to unpack. And if we keep on relying on what's likely to hit the New York Times tomorrow, we really risk creating a very bad environment.
And I mean, I think, Kate, if you want to talk a little bit about sort of the impact that you've seen in your research based off of these things not being prioritized, and speaking a little to just what's at stake, I guess.
Well, I don't think we have the time or maybe the emotional capacity to look at the full campaign against the white helmets on social media right now, and I'm not going to explain the ins and outs of it. But we've been doing analysis on that particular context for over a year now, so we have deep contextual knowledge of that space. And one of the more recent analyses that we finally did was looking at a couple of different things, and there's this very holistic view of what was happening specifically on Twitter, because we can start there, but also how you can look at tweets and see the surrounding ecosystem of websites. And I can talk a lot about that ecosystem because it's fascinating. But the number one domain that's cited by the people that are by the accounts that are criticizing, delegitimizing the white helmets, the number one domain is YouTube. And that is a major resource in their campaign to delegitimize the white helmets. And we're going to go dive a little bit deeper into that. You've talked about we know some of the videos that are there and what's going on there. But these campaigns, these disinformation campaigns, are multi-platform, and they're very diverse and multidimensional. And yet we can see, but from the view of any one platform, you can see what impact they're having, and a lot of these platforms are having a lot of impact on that conversation.
It sort of feels as, and I'm just, and anyone can sort of take this, but it feels more and more as a reporter in this space that all roads kind of do lead to YouTube a lot of the time. That it just sort of feels like it is sort of the beating heart and of the disinformation ecosystem. Do you guys feel that that's an accurate thing, or
can I start and then I'll pass it off?
Yeah.
What's really interesting, you say that, and yet it's one of the most understudied platforms from the research side in this space. And so I think, if anything, it's maybe a blind spot on our parts for why haven't we been focusing on it. Just I think in the next few months you're going to see a lot more content come out about it, because we know it's there, we know it's happening, and yet for some reason it's been very understudied.
Yeah, I think it's understudied because when people post something on Twitter on someone, you see a friend tweeting something weird, you investigate it. But on YouTube, you don't see people going down the rabbit holes. Like the flat Earth, you wouldn't imagine that it's been recommended by YouTube hundreds of millions of times. You have no idea. So that's why I think it's been under-recommended.
I think I come from a different perspective, because at Google I was doing also counterterrorism work, and in the counterterrorism scene, YouTube is very heavily studied, and so there's entire departments and fields that study the dissemination of information that really very much focus on videos. Of course, because it turned out that a lot of recruiting and extremist violent videos, production were videos, and therefore YouTube mattered there. So I come from a space where YouTube was very, very heavily invested and not at all like understudied or mysterious. I will say though that I don't think one platform is the problem. What you're facing is adversaries who are really good at playing each platform against one another. And Kate, you and I were just talking about this at the beginning of a bad campaign. It's a lot of elbow grease, right? So you see attackers sort of like very tactically injecting messages here and there, and we're going to make an Instagram account that's going to promote our Twitter account. The Twitter account is going to send links to the YouTube account, and with the YouTube account, we're going to advertise our blog, and with our et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. And so you do this sort of like, you crank it out manually, and at some point, you reach a threshold in which your campaign, sort of like surfing, can catch the wave of algorithmic amplification, and this cross-platform feature becomes a problem and becomes a source of the amplification. And so you end up with signals. There's a very potent and strong Twitter account that is sending a lot of inbound traffic from YouTube. That creates a good signal for YouTube, and that in return maybe creates a good signal for the domain, the URL, that maybe end up being promoting a news, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like all cranked up manually until you reach a threshold where algorithmic amplification really becomes an issue.
I think if I could just point out, I would agree completely. It's about looking at more than one platform. I think from our perspective, what's actually received the most attention is actually Facebook from a political advertising context. But I think YouTube unquestionably, along with the other key platforms, one of the fundamental challenges is, in terms of how you address and limit this, is to try and have some kind of oversight of disinformation or fake news. Is who decides on that? And there are initiatives. The European Union has put together a code of conduct on disinformation, which is intended to try and to strangulate the flow of revenue into that marketplace. But I can tell you from personal experience on something that's more straightforward, so pirate content. So if you can find someone who will be a backstop, a legal, like we have a police intellectual property crime unit, they'll be the backstop to say this is IP infringement, to give someone the responsibility to call, whether it's Interpol, Europol, the Department of Homeland Security, whomever, to give anyone the backstop to say this is fake news and this isn't, is something that we instantly, I think, all get quite nervous around. And that, I think, is the foundation point of it.
I want to talk a little bit about, I mean, we're touching on advertising, and this is your ecosystem. I mean, the ad world has obviously been completely changed by all the ad tech that's being thrown in it, and smart people that I know are always telling me that it's sort of at the root of a lot of the problems from a mechanics standpoint of the internet. And this is sort of a broad question, but I allow, I think, a couple of people to jump in. But I think a lot, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Facebook advertising, how to sort of limit the financial incentives for people, because I think that is one of the most sort of pernicious forces that I see on the internet. I spend a lot of time reporting on the rise of the pro-Trump media that has come up, and they all have incredible financial incentive, be it Alex Jones, be it whoever, to manipulate these platforms. And I think that I'm curious, first Nigel, but then anyone, like, how do we start thinking about creative and useful ways to limit the financial incentive for bad actors on these platforms without sort of destroying what's at the heart of them, which is the ability to create businesses, make money, have good parts of the enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, so my industry's pretty much at the root of, well, actually, other than properly bad actors like, kind of dangerous foreign nations and things, but other than that, advertising is pretty high on the list of things that have screwed things up. And I think in our defense, and this is back to the point about unforeseen consequences, the way we talk about it, and the reason why we've had some initiatives around it is we see data collection and targeting around products and services. So, if you're into scuba diving, getting scuba diving holiday ads, that's pretty benign. That might involve quite a lot of data. That kind of use of data to inform ad tech, as we describe it, as having been weaponized, and it's been weaponized in ways that quite quickly move beyond the kind of the space of commerce. And commerce can be pretty grubby, but to move into the world of causes and politics, we would say that there's a need to really give some special oversight to that. And regulation can be really tough because, who watches the watchmen? Who decides who regulates? Perversely, in the UK, I'm not sure in the States, but pretty much the only type of advertising that isn't regulated, that doesn't have to be legal, honest, decent, and truthful, is political advertising. Which is crazy, but that's because politicians don't want anyone to have oversight over them because they think they'll be the other guy's politician. The right thinks it'll be the left's, and the left thinks it'll be the right, with oversight. So, that's one thing. Secondly, politics needs, certainly in our current way of operation, it needs the public sphere for debate. You don't need to have a public sphere debate about sports cars or bathrobes. So I would suggest that we need to say, what are the issues that are fundamental to threatening, and frankly, Western liberal democracy, because that's the way, just about the best example of anything that's ever happened in the world until someone shows something better. How do we say, look, the commercial engine is fine, but we need to protect these other parts? And I defer to others to talk more about that, but I've got some ideas.
So they've asked us a little bit to try and be solutions oriented here, which is easier said than done, I think, when it comes to all of this. But I want to try to talk a little bit about solutions. I mean, it feels like we're just increasingly headed towards an internet that relies on algorithms and artificial intelligence to help control and moderate. I mean, the internet is only getting bigger. And that feels like a terrifying path right now. That you talk to these tech companies, and it's the idea of throwing more technology at a problem created by technology. I'm curious, what do we do? Can companies like YouTube ever move beyond optimizing to keep people on site? Like, can we rearrange this idea of giving people more and more of what they want and making lots of money off of it?
Yeah, I think at some point people need to realize that it's going to be bad, so they need to listen to Tristan and be like, okay, we want something else. And then when people realize, then YouTube can move their OKRs and put it on top priority on their OKRs to change the game. So to give you an example on how low what we're talking about, disinformation, is on the OKR of YouTube in 2016, before the election. I noticed things were becoming really weird on YouTube, with Alex Jones being promoted a lot. So I went to a friend at YouTube and I told him, like, hey, it seems that some people might be gaming the YouTube algorithm, and do you have anything to fight against that? They say, no, we're fighting against people who are gaming our recommendations for money, so we're taking care of. But for political game, I mean, it's like a fair game. You have like a system that's the same for everybody, so it's a game, so anybody can try to be the most successful. So the system is not designed to be robust to foreign interference. So first we need to tell to Google that that's a priority, to make a system that's more robust to this type of foreign interference.
Do you guys think that we're there at any point? Like, part of it was at some point people need to start to become fed up. I mean, I feel in my world like we're reaching that critical mass. But I mean, what do you feel?
Well, I think there's a real difficulty here because we're a little bit conflating. There's these technical problems that are super hard. Technical that may involve AI, they may involve crowdsourcing, internal operations with the companies, that's part of it. But before you can even solve the technical problems, you have to solve the socio-technical problems, which are even coming up with a criteria of what do we mean by solving these? We've got this tension between freedom of speech and our ideas of freedom of speech versus these things that we brought up of like possibly censoring actors that aren't necessarily bad actors, they're just people that think differently from us. And I don't think we've even, as the users of these platforms, as the people that create these platforms, and then the politicians that are seeking to game these platforms themselves, I don't think that there's a clear path forward for the technology companies on what the right decisions are. One of the pieces on this that I just have to use this opportunity to say, I keep saying it to the technology companies, is currently the people in power all over the world have used these platforms to spread disinformation. Most recently, this disinformation was a part of ascendant power all over the world. And so anything the companies do to stop that from happening, they're going to be accused of being politically biased. We've already seen that argument work. And that argument,
already accused.
Yeah, that argument pushes them back on their heels, and then they try to accommodate that argument. And the real problem for me is I don't think you can accommodate that argument and solve the problem. And so the companies have to say, this is what we're going to do, this is what we believe in, and we're not going to accommodate that argument. I don't know how they do that, but I think that has to happen.
Yeah, I think the first way you do that is you ensure that there is a strong body of research that tells you what on earth is going on the internet that isn't just coming from the platform. And so enabling research, not necessarily adversarial research, but critical research that says, okay, what is going on in the information ecosystem? Research like yours, or research like yours, Guillaume, in which you say, like, hey, I can map what does a recommendation algorithm shows and does on a specific topic. I think that's the very first important step, like making sure that as a society we have a view of how this ecosystem is evolving and we're able to have a critical conversation with the platforms.
Just as researchers, do you both feel like there's any movement from the big technology companies in that space, that they're relaxing a little? I know Facebook and Twitter are doing a little more, at least from a public relations standpoint, to seem like they're moving forward. But I guess my two questions are: do you think that they're relaxing that and giving researchers access to the kind of data they need to help paint this picture? And the addendum to that is what do you want to see? Like, what would be ideal for you guys to have that you don't have right now?
So yeah, on YouTube, we need to know what gets the most recommended. Like, we need to know if Pizzagate is more recommended, or if like Hollywood Access Tape is more recommended. During the 2016 election, Pizzagate was much more recommended by the algorithm. So we need to know in which reality we live in. So having general statistics like from the platform would be great. Otherwise, we can try to get them, but then it's only approximations from the outside.
Kate?
And of course,
No, please.
Of course, the data conversation is difficult because no one knows if you're an academic researcher or a Cambridge Analytica executive. Like, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think it's not only just the data, right? Like, there's a lot of openness that is starting to happen around platforms saying, like, hey, I don't think we totally had it right on this rule. Twitter just did that, for instance. They looked at dehumanizing speech. They said, we looked at what everyone was reporting on these massive hate speech campaigns that were targeting notably minorities. And we understand that this kind of fell in between the lines of different policies, and we want to create a new one. They're putting this way better than me in their blog post. And they worked with human rights researchers to create this new policy, put it out, and say, we're going to test it out, and opening it to a round of feedback from people. Well, that's interesting. And we also have companies being a little bit more transparent about their own content moderation numbers, right? Up until then, we had no idea the amount of stuff that was taken down from the platform. That wasn't part of what the platform were reporting on as part of their transparency report. So there are myriads of different small and big ways in which we can start having a more transparent and data-based dialogue on what's happening in our information ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
I think the question of data for researchers is it's a complex one. I'm not always. I know other researchers are like, "Oh, just give us more data," but there's huge restrictions on the platforms. Twitter data we've used for years now, since I guess 2008 when I first started studying that platform. But it was always public, and the users knew it was public. With Facebook data, it's really different to try to make that kind of data available to researchers that are outside of Facebook. And so I think coming up with the configurations that enables research to happen in a way that privacy violations are limited, that they can kind of vet the researchers so we don't end up with situations like Cambridge Analytica, but where the researchers still have enough independence that they can report on what they're finding, even though the platforms might not like what they find. And I think kind of developing those kinds of configurations, and folks are working on it. There's that Social Science Research Initiative that's giving access to a limited view of Facebook data, where Facebook provides the data, but somebody else does the oversight and manages that. And so they don't have their hands in how the research is actually done, but they know that their data is kind of protected. I think configurations like that are a way to go forward with this, and other ways of just having researchers maybe come inside these companies, so having independent research being able to be done, but in a way that still protects the privacy of the users of those platforms and their expectations.
I mean, I do think that there's a need to apply a degree of kind of commercial realism. These are commercial entities, publicly listed companies generally, and I think Tim O'Reilly, he was the guy that coined the phrase Web 2.0. He talked about them suffering from a runaway objective function. Mm-hmm. So they literally in Facebook's case, all they care about is engagement. And engagement creates more data and more inventory to sell ads into. And they were so blinkered by the pursuit of that runaway objective function, they didn't see anything around them. So if pressure can be brought to bear as to why they need to think about things on a longer time frame than just the next quarterly revenue reporting, that would be my recommendation, because that's what they are primarily motivated by.
Can I ask a question? Where should that pressure come from?
That's a really good point. So, first of all, I'm going to say why it shouldn't come from my constituency. But joking aside, so the problem, and the Professor Scott Galloway talked about where he thought it would end up, and he said it probably won't be advertisers, because one advertiser could unilaterally say, I'm going to take a stand, I'm not doing this. Procter & Gamble could say, we're not going to advertise on Google and YouTube or Facebook until these things change. But then the problem happens that there are executives who have targets within that business, and if their targets stop dropping because they're not reaching the audience that they thought they were going to reach because they're not using those platforms, there will be internal pressure to shift. So there is a problem with the ability to unilaterally deliver as a commercial operation. He didn't think it would come from the US government either, because he thought there was a significant interplay of things that happen in Washington, like lobbying, combined with the importance of those businesses as US businesses. He thought it would probably come from the European Union, from Brussels. And you've seen things like GDPR, which has emerged as slightly related. It's not perfect, but there is certainly a pressure where the European Union is of sufficient scale, even though it's not majority of their user base, to try and drive some change. So I would think it would be something around a combination of regulation, or collectively the platform, individually or collectively, the platforms agreeing to more carefully to showcase how they're operating things to someone else in a more self-regulatory way.
Well, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Can I also make a case for the small, lame steps? I think we're right
Absolutely.
to put all of this back in context, and the advertising industry has wrecked our, media ecosystem. But I think there's also smaller bits and pieces that we can chip off the problem. And so I think about patriotic trolling, and Mariano, you talked about that this morning. The fact that governments use social media to harass human rights activists and journalists around the world and silence them more often than not doesn't have anything to do with advertising. More often than not is a problem we can solve without extraordinary pressure. It needs to be considered, prioritized, documented, thought through. It doesn't solve the entire disinformation ecosystem, but it alleviates the harm that is very visible, very there, and that we can sort of like chip off. So I know it's kind of lame too, but taking this entire piece of what we call disinformation and saying, okay, here I see one problem that I can define, analyze, and maybe try to find a better way to tackle. And I think we see sort of smaller steps towards that, right? So the dissemination of leaked material that are actually hacked. How do we do this across the industry? How do we better protect users so that their accounts are not hacked? What do we do when they are? How do we notify them? How do we teach them, hey, I think a government is trying to get your emails? How do we make sure that they don't end up being disseminated on social media? So I'm also sort of like making the case for chipping off smaller and definitely not full picture, but smaller bits and pieces of that problem that can be tackled almost on their own.
And it feels a bit like, and you can respond, it feels a bit like, the actual thing that can be done is these companies taking somewhat of a stand and stopping that mentality of we are just an open platform. We are, I look at what happened over August with Alex Jones and the deplatforming of bad actors who are violating your terms of service and your rules, and I think that I think we're seeing, as with someone like Alex Jones, as with the troll Milo Yiannopoulos before him, the deplatforming of some of these people has radical immediate effects, and they aren't necessarily tied to the sticky wicket of your advertising business or your bottom line. They are simply small little, as you said, things you can break off, but it requires these companies to take a stand, to have a sort of a moral backbone, which I think is really uncomfortable.
Yeah, on the dialogue also with external user. For a long time, when you asked Google about their ethics, they were like, "Oh, we do our stuff. If you're not happy, you can just leave the platform." But yeah, there need to be a dialogue, and we see with Twitter like this dialogue how they're initiating it, and it's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the idea now that if you don't like it, you can just leave Google is no longer a valid argument. No one can really just leave Google or leave Facebook and not participate, especially if you are a media company, if you are a major advertiser, say.
But I think, Shani, the point that you're highlighting also goes to the question we're asking about prioritization, right? So you have people all around the world who are reading the news saying, "Oh yeah, this guy Alex Jones was deplatformed because sometimes he says shit that are crazy." And they're like, "What? Do they want to see my feed? Do they want to see what constant harassment, total fake news ecosystem, death threats, rape threat, vitriolic attack nonstop 24/7 looks like? Why isn't that reaching my community? Like, why did that happen? What did the Alex Jones guy did? What can we do to my guys to put them on the map?" And I think you're right. And then the thing that's coming, is how do you do this at scale in a way that's not reactive again to what's in the press, to electoral cycles, right? To what's likely to hit close to Silicon Valley headquarters. How do you do that in a way that's fair for your global community of users? I think that's extraordinarily difficult.
So Francois Cholet, who's a deep learning engineer at Google, published recently a blog post in which he explains how deep learning is actually machine learning and AI is dangerous compared to manipulation, disinformation, and manipulation campaigns. And he proposed methodologies that are more robust to that. So for anybody who's interested in solution, I encourage to read this Medium post.
So I'll just a couple of points just in reference to the banning or deplatforming. So I kind of follow some of this a little bit. It's slightly out of my purview, but Milo Yiannopoulos, my sense was that he was achieving some personal beneficial notoriety from his deplatforming, certainly at live events and then on Twitter. And actually, the thing that did for him was talking too much and saying something about, he made a comment around relationships between older men and teenage boys and how that could be great. And actually, that kind of did for him. So, I'm not sure, I don't like those guys. I mean, I think Alex Jones is a laughing stock to myself, but I really don't know whether deplatforming helps them or hurts them, because you get these characters that claim now that it plays into a kind of a trope about the liberal elites running the MSM, and all of these cliched words that suddenly are coming out from somewhere. Didn't he say we're all Alex Jones now? I kind of sense that he made something of it, and I don't know if that was a success or not. And just the other point, slightly related, he reminded me, I was astounded when I first came to the States and heard many years ago shock jocks, radio shock jocks. And so there seems to be like an analog whole thing that happened for years, if not decades, before the sense of the internet and things and fake news. So I don't know how they relate to each other, other than they kind of both involve Alex Jones and his shouty persona. But so two things: platforming, no platforming, don't know. What about analog predecessors to this kind of disinformation?
Well, I mean, I think that this is this is why this problem is so difficult. Is our standing up and deplatforming certain prominent bad actors, is that are you getting rid of, are you treating a symptom or are you treating a disease, and where does that land? And I think that's difficult. But one sort of solutions-based question that I was curious to ask you guys is, I mean, how can we think about using algorithms and deep learning, artificial intelligence? How can we deploy our technology to build up positive relationships via these platforms, as opposed to, constantly exploit and manipulate? And are there any, I get very pessimistic about this stuff very quickly, but I'm curious if you guys, have any reasons to be hopeful.
I think it's interesting that we can say, okay, the algorithms are causing these problems, but if we just fix the algorithms, that's just, everything's going to get better, or we can, here's the problem. But there's a lot of folks talking about this in the places that I do research that are really thinking about the algorithms can be very biased. They can be black boxes that we don't understand how they work. There is something to be said for people seem to be more willing to give up some decisions to algorithms where they don't want people to make those decisions, and yet we don't know why the algorithms are making those decisions and other things. So I'm always wary about, and I think maybe this is the problem, is that these platforms are having to deal with all of this content. They've got to find some way to process it, but the algorithms themselves seem to be taking them into these kind of dead ends and leading them into these kind of resonant behaviors that aren't necessarily positive. And so the idea that we're going to fix it with an algorithm, for me, is maybe a little bit too simplistic, and it may actually be that we need more human-in-the-loop solutions, which are more expensive for the companies, which are harder to manage, which have these, they're susceptible to these accusations of bias, but they're no more biased than the algorithms, but people just don't understand that. But I think it is. I really think that we don't. I don't think we should say the solution should be algorithmic. I think we should say the solution should be holistic, and that maybe it is that they need to be hiring more people, and they need to think about it's not so great for their bottom line, but in the near term. But it may be that we need more humans in the loop, more people helping to make these decisions.
Working inside these technology companies, do you think that is a viable solution? Because talking to these companies as a reporter, it's just not on the table oftentimes. I mean, there is, in the sense of, we'll add 5,000 part-time moderators working out of a country far away, and they have 2 seconds to make a very difficult content decision, and are bombarded with terrible things, and eventually end up having post-traumatic stress disorder. But we can add those 5,000, sure, but that's not going to change the fact that there's thousands of hours of content being uploaded to all these platforms.
This is a whack-a-mole game, so you need to. I'm actually very optimistic, like on the long term, because now, like the design by design is just so bad. Just to think that maximizing the number of clicks is going to be good for the world is like it's absurd when you think of it. And all this misinformation, it works great because misinformation is great for clicks. Click is great for them. So if we have a design that makes sense, that like Francois Cholet proposes, for instance, designs that give more control to the user, where the objective function of the AI is a goal set by the user, then you can have an AI that's actually doing a lot of good in society.
But do we know what we want? I feel that's
it's part of the kind of negotiation there, and the in between is that, and there's research being done into how do we make AI in a way that we can open up the black box and understand why it's working that way. So in a way that you can, the user's making decisions of how they want it to work, but can we understand why it's making that decision? Is there a way to open those up, both for the people making the decisions at the company, but also at the user level, for understanding why is this algorithm giving me this information right now?
Yeah, we can definitely do algorithms that are explainable, and maybe we should do them, but they are a bit less efficient, so that's why they don't want to do that.
I'm with you here, Guillaume. I think we are I think the trend is positive. It's going to get better. I want to highlight how new these problems are. Today, there is a field around machine learning fairness. There's a true academic field around machine learning fairness. There are entire teams in tech companies that are dedicated to machine learning fairness. I have seen the first one emerge at Google. I was part of that adventure. It was great, fascinating to see. This is new. This is things that we are catching up with. I remember the first fairness and accountability and transparency in machine learning conference, FATML, a wonderful academic conference. The first one was a couple years ago. Now it's an entire field of people. So we're also very much at the beginning of that curve, catching up with sort of like the monster. Tristan, I don't remember the term you used, but sort of like, the Frankenstein, sort of like all reflecting back upon the Frankenstein and trying to both quickly patch the system where we can patch it and also put the groundwork into creating those new disciplines and those new structures, those entire new fields, frankly, that's going to help us create a more sustainable approach going forward.
I think as a good way, because I think we're getting onto time here. A good way to end this, I think, would be to hear your down the line recommendations for, as this field, like as we wait for some of these solutions to come, and as what can everyone in this room, people who are may not be professionals, may never have worked in these companies, may just be grappling with these problems for the first time. What would you recommend that we keep in mind or be vigilant for? I mean, how do we kind of go about as citizens, making sure that we can hold these companies accountable, and also be good consumers of information?
So one of the foci of our research in my lab is really to help people broadly, the technology companies, yes, journalists, yes, but actually everyday users just understand where we're vulnerable, how we're vulnerable, and where we're targeted. And I give talks, I test these talks at libraries, old folks' homes, all these different places to kind of see how do we help people understand where they're vulnerable. And one of the last line I end a lot of these talks on is, we talk about critical thinking, we talk about logic, but most manipulation does not happen here. Most manipulation happens through emotion and intuition. And if we're encountering things online, which I did yesterday, that make us feel sort of moral outrage and anger and frustration at the other side, that's the opportunity, that's the vulnerability we have to being exposed to and becoming part of a disinformation campaign. And to really point out that it's not the other people on the right, it's not the alt-right, it's not the alt-left, it's all of us. We're all targeted and we're all vulnerable in those spaces. And that's my line.
I'm really curious how those old folks' homes talks about the internet.
It's fascinating. I will tell people at dinner if they're curious.
So yeah, my point is that we have to ask the platforms, like, okay, what do you do to fight disinformation operations? How much do you invest in that? Because if the amounts are ridiculous, I mean, it's a real problem, and the amounts now are pretty low. And Twitter is doing a much better job now. And Facebook is also improving a lot. So we have to hold them accountable and ask them what they're doing.
It's a tough question if you think about like everyday people, because I think the media has their responsibilities, research has their responsibilities, but I think, back to Kate's point, this is also an emotional space. Right. And I think therefore people care. They have things that they care particularly about, and that's okay. If you care about women being harassed online, that's fine, stand up for that. If you particularly care about anti-vax conspiracies, because that was your experience, stand up for that. And I think disinformation is not a very abstract problem that we sometimes make it up to be. It also touches people in different ways. And I think it's okay for people to identify the part of it that really gets them, and then to help document and then be part of the solution on these parts. You don't have to tackle the death of the advertising industry in order to first care about the problems that most affect you as a citizen in your daily life.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. So I would say, and advertising is about the art of persuasion. So this kind of comes full circle back to what we're talking about in technology and persuasion and ethics. And And frankly, I would say there are particular areas that are of particular concern to like society, and you kind of need to rank them. And I think there's all sorts of issues around happiness and satisfaction. The only things I would say transcend above that are things that relate to society that can impact those directly, and that's things around, I think, political discourse, cause-based issues, everything of that kind of nature. I would say we need to really think about quarantining that and looking at what kind of interventions are required with the tech partners partnering around that. The rest is, and I would work down the ranking in that respect. We can't solve everything right now, but just as if you want something about solutions based, I was trying to think of something positive. So there was a referendum in Ireland earlier this year on it was around abortion laws, and because of perceived overseas interference in that debate, Facebook banned all overseas political ads relate to that cause, and Google banned all political ads on that subject completely, including in Ireland. So I think that's where you're seeing someone, the tech companies, taking responsibility to have an intervention at a point in time. And I think that, as an example, should guide us. When things get really, really, kind of a national, cultural consequence, we need to think about how to quarantine it.
And with that, I'd like to thank you all for this. This is wonderful. These are difficult questions. It's hard to put a bow on any of it. But I thank you for the work you do and for sharing it with us. So appreciate it.
Thank you.